This morning we're continuing our series in Leviticus. We're going to be in Leviticus chapter 25, looking at redemption. Specifically, we're going to start off looking at Jubilee and some other kinds of Sabbath here in verses 1 through 22. We're going to dive straight in. Yahweh spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai, saying, "Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land that I give you, the land shall keep a Sabbath to Yahweh. For 6 years you shall sow your field, for 6 years you shall prune your vineyard and gather in its fruits. But in the 7th year there shall be a Sabbath of solemn rest for the land, a Sabbath to Yahweh. You shall not sow your field or prune your vineyard. You shall not reap what grows of itself in your harvest, or gather the grapes of your undressed vines. It shall be a year of solemn rest for the land. The Sabbath of the land shall provide food for you, for yourself and for your male and female slaves, for your hired worker and the sojourner who lives with you, and for your cattle and for the wild animals that are in your land. All its yield shall be for food. You shall count 7 weeks of years, 7 times 7 years, so that the time of the 7 weeks of 7 of years shall give you 49 years. You shall sound the trumpet on the 10th day of the 7th month. On the Day of Atonement, you shall sound the trumpet throughout all your land. You shall consecrate the 50th year and proclaim liberty through the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you, when each of you shall return to his property, and each of you shall return to his clan. The 50th year shall be a jubilee for you. In it you shall neither sow nor reap what grows of itself, nor gather the grapes of the undressed vines, for it is a jubilee. It shall be holy to you. You may eat the produce of the land. In the year of Jubilee, each of you shall return to his property. If you make a sale of your neighbor or buy from your neighbor, you shall not wrong one another. You shall pay your neighbor according to the number of years after the Jubilee, and shall sell to you according to the number of years for crops. If the years are many, you shall increase the price. If the years are few, you shall reduce the price, whereas the number of crops he is selling you. You shall not wrong one another, but you shall fear your God. I am Yahweh your God. Therefore, you shall do my statutes and keep my rules and perform them. And then you will dwell in the land securely. The land will yield its fruit. You will eat your fill and dwell in it securely. If you say, what shall we eat in the 7th year? We may not sow or gather in our crop. I will command my blessing on you in the 6th year, so that it will produce a crop sufficient for 3 years. When you sow in the 8th year, you will be eating some of the crop. You shall eat the old until the 9th year, when its crop arrives." Okay. So first off, we get this concept of the Sabbath for the land. That the land itself will have a Sabbath as well. Every 7th year, the Israelites should not sow their fields. They should not prune their vineyards. They should not reap. They should not gather in the traditional sense. That the land should rest. And interestingly, we know that this is good agricultural practice, right? We know that this is what farmers do even to this day, that every good farmer allows his fields to at times lie fallow. They typically do it in a rotating basis where they have one field fallow every year so that the land gets a rest. But here, God's saying in Israel, He wants them all the land to take a rest every 7 years. On the 7th year, they should just not do anything at all there. Now, they could not reap or gather in the usual fashion, but they could eat from what came up naturally. So they couldn't sow crops, but they could eat what just came up on its own. And you know, if you've had a garden, you always get those kind of volunteer plants that you didn't plant that year, but has come up from seeds that you planted the previous year. So that would happen in these fields. They would have stuff that just came up. And He tells them that they can eat that food. They just can't harvest it in that way. So verse 5 tells them they should not reap what grows of itself or gather the grapes of the undressed vine. But then verse 6 tells them that the Sabbath of the land shall provide food for you, for yourself, for your female slaves. Verse 7 says, all its yield shall be for food. He's telling them it's not for crops, it's just for food. So you can't gather a crop, right? You can't harvest a whole crop and store it, but each day you can go out and get some food. So see the difference there? They're not reaping and storing these crops in the traditional sense. They're just going out, getting some food for the day, and eating it. What's the purpose of the land Sabbath, right? They already have a Sabbath for themselves that they take every week, that they take a day off of work, they cease from working. What's the purpose of the land taking a Sabbath? Well, we already established it's good agricultural practice. It's also a reminder that the land is not theirs, that the land belongs to Yahweh. And lastly, it's a chance for them to trust Yahweh. It's a chance for them to practice their trust in Yahweh's provision. Now, every 50th year, or after 7 cycles of 7 years, a Jubilee year would be proclaimed. So on the Day of Atonement, during the 49th year, the trumpets would sound, signaling that the following year would be a year of Jubilee. Now, it happens at this time, happens during that time of the 49th year, because that is the end of the agricultural cycle. The Day of Atonement would occur at the end of the grape harvest, and that would then kind of be the reset of the next thing that's going to happen is planting for spring. And so they would essentially be like, after that trumpet blast, no planting for the next year. They would do that for all the other Sabbaths as well. That would be when the Sabbath kind of starts. Now, after this times, there's so no new planting. So this Jubilee year is more than just a bonus rest for the land. It's also this return of property, that all property would return to their original owners. The people would return to the land that they belong on. And this is the concept that property could not be purchased forever. That when the Israelites entered the Promised Land, because remember, all of this is being given to them before they enter the Promised Land. When they enter the Promised Land, all the tribes are going to be granted different sections of land. And what God is telling them essentially is, I'm going to give you that land, and then you're going to divide that up among yourselves. Different families are going to take portions of the land. That's going to be the land that is granted to you in perpetuity. Forever, that's going to be your tribe's land. Some member of that tribe or some member of that family is going to live on that land forever. Now, you might come to a point where you want to sell some of that land to somebody else. Maybe another family within the tribe, or to a neighboring tribe, you might want to sell some of that land. He tells them they can do it, but they essentially can only lease it for the remaining years until the Jubilee. On this Jubilee year, on this 50th year, all the land is going to reset to its original allocations. Meaning that then he tells them that they can't cheat one another in this, that this isn't a means of saying that like ripping people off, that they essentially are going to reset it every year, every 50th year. So you got to know how many years until the next Jubilee to know what the price is going to be. Right? If there's going to be 45 years till the next Jubilee, the price is going to be a lot higher than if there's only 5 years to the next Jubilee. The next 5 years is going to be much lower than if it's 45 years. It should be roughly 9 times lower, right? A ninth of that price. So it's not a means of anybody getting ripped off. It's not a means of anybody getting a deal or anything like that. This is just a mandated return date that they do every year. They're going to reset the land. And this is, again, a reminder that the land belongs to Yahweh. It's His to grant. It's His to say, here's who it belongs to. And so it's always going to go back to the original owners, or the original grantees, essentially. Now, this Jubilee year also creates an additional challenge, right? They're already going to take off every 7th year as a Sabbath year where they're not going to plant any crops. They're not going to harvest any crops. But now this Jubilee year is going to occur on the 50th year, meaning you're going to have 2 years in a row. You're going to have a Sabbath year followed immediately by a Jubilee year. Now you're going to have 2 years in a row where you're not going to plant any crops. Now I know that we're pretty distanced from agriculture. Most of us are pretty distanced from the agricultural process that we live in and the way that we get food and that kind of things. Like you just go to the store, right? And you don't think a lot beyond like, how did this get here? Unless you're like driving down I-5 to Southern California, and you pass all those fields, and you go, oh, there's where they grow all of our food. Cool. Right? But we have seen what happened over these last couple of years. We've seen what happens when there's any kind of shortage of any product. Right? Because, about every week right now, they come out and say, there's going to be a shortage of fill in the blank. Right? There's a new shortage, that there's some problem in the process where there's going to be a shortage of that. And what happens? Everybody freaks out. Everybody loses their mind and goes to try to get it, and you're losing your mind. The first thing we did was the toilet paper. But there's been other things now where there's been these temporary shortages, and people freak out when there's going to be a shortage of anything. So can you imagine if the president came out tomorrow and was like, we're going to not plant or harvest any crops for 2 years? Oh man, people would lose it. People would freak out. Because the question that the Israelites are going to have naturally is, but then what are we going to eat? Right? If we don't get to plant crops for 2 years, what are we going to eat? I mean, there's going to be some stuff we can go out and just get that might come up naturally, but we really need to, if we're going to feed the nation, we have to plant some crops. What are we going to eat if we're not allowed to plant crops for 2 years in a row? And we see in this passage that God promises to provide a bumper crop in the 6th year, a crop that will be sufficient for 3 years, right? He says you're actually going to still be eating from that crop in the 9th year. So it's going to be no problem to get through the 7th and 8th year if you do what I say. He's going to provide this bumper crop if they are obedient. If the Israelites obey, then God will provide. Now, this is also true for us, that if we are obedient to what God has asked of us, He will provide what is necessary to accomplish His purposes. Now, I need you to hear that correctly, right? That if we are obedient to what God has asked of us, He will provide what is necessary to accomplish His purposes, not our purposes. This is where we get it twisted sometimes, because we look at these passages like this in the Old Testament. I mean, it's so clear, right? If they obey, God will provide this bumper crop for them. If they obey Him, He will provide for them materially. Very clear, He will provide food. If they obey Him in regards to producing their food, He will provide enough food for them. It's very concrete, very simple. For us, it's maybe more complicated, right? Sometimes the things He asks us to do are more complicated than that. He hasn't really asked us to, this isn't, you don't go home with this and go like, well, I guess I need to figure out when I first planted my garden and count 7 years and not plant it. That's not really what we're talking about here. Right? What He asks us to do is sometimes more complicated. Somebody asks us to step out in faith and do something, or support a missionary, or go on a mission trip, or something like that, or go and reach out to our neighbor, or something like that He will provide for us when we respond to accomplish His purposes. It's the problem we have as the church, is because our promises are different than God's promises to Israel. And we see verses like Romans 8:28, where He says, we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good for those who are called according to His purpose. We see this passage and we get excited, right? We go like, for those who love God, I love God. That's me. Cool. Oh, He's talking about me. Okay, cool. Because I definitely love God. I'm on board. Cool. All things work together for good. Great. I want a good. I've got some good ideas of what that could be. Right? God is going to work all things together for good. I'd love to hear it, because I've got some good ideas about what that good could be. So God, let's negotiate this so that I get the good that I want. Right? The problem when we read that verse is you don't get to define good in that verse. God gets to define good in that verse. And it's clear if we keep reading, because He says, for those who are called according to His purpose. It's according to His purpose. So it's His definition of good, which for some Christians in history has not been necessarily what they think that good should be. We just see that it's ultimately His definition of what is good, His purposes that we are to seek to accomplish. And that is always true, that all things work together for the good that He has in mind. We also see in verse 18 of this passage that God provides a direct promise to Israel that if they are obedient, that they will dwell in the land securely. If they are obedient, they will dwell in the land securely. And as we continue to read the Old Testament, we can see this play out. You can see this play out as you read through the rest of the Old Testament, that when Israel is obedient, they enjoy prosperity in the promised land. But when they are not obedient, God removes his hand of protection from them. This is, again, a very different arrangement than God has with the church. And we're going to look a lot more at this next week. But we see just a difference in the way that God deals with the church and the promises that he has given us, because we are not promised earthly material blessing. In fact, we are promised persecution. In Matthew chapter 10, 21 through 23, he says, "Brother will deliver brother over to death." This is Jesus talking to his disciples. "The father his child, and children will rise against parents and have them put to death. You will be hated by all for my name's sake." That's a promise. You like to see promises in Scripture? Verse 22, "You will be hated by all for my name's sake." God gives you a promise. Jesus gives you a promise. "But the one who endures to the end will be saved. When they persecute you in one town, flee to the next. For truly I say to you, you will not have gone through all the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes." Tells them that they will face persecution, that they will be hated. Like, there are promises that he gives us. They're just not of earthly blessing. We have a heavenly home. Again, we'll look at that, getting a little ahead of myself. We'll look at that more next Sunday. Verses 23 through 34. "The land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine. For you are strangers and sojourners with me, and in all the country you possess you shall allow redemption of the land. If your brother becomes poor and sells part of his property, then his nearest redeemer shall come and redeem what his brother has sold. If a man has no one to redeem it, then himself becomes prosperous and finds sufficient means to redeem it. Let him calculate the years since he sold it and pay back the balance to the man to whom he sold it. Then return to his property. But if he does not have sufficient means to recover it, then what he sold shall remain in the hand of the buyer until the year of Jubilee. In the Jubilee it shall be released, and he shall return to his property. If a man sells a dwelling house in a walled city, he may redeem it within a year of its sale. For a full year he shall have the right of redemption. If it is not redeemed within a full year, then the house and the walled city shall belong in perpetuity to the buyer throughout his generations. It shall not be released in the Jubilee. But the houses of the villages that have no wall around them shall be classified with the fields of the land. They may be redeemed, and they shall be released in the Jubilee. As for the cities of the Levites may redeem at any time the houses and the cities they possess. And if one of the Levites exercises his right of redemption, then the house that was sold in a city they possess shall be released in the Jubilee. For the houses of the cities of the Levites are their possession among the people of Israel. But the fields of the pasture land belonging to their cities may not be sold, for that is their possession forever. So verse 23 starts with a novel concept of land ownership, at least for us here in the United States, that the land all belongs to God. That the Israelites never truly own any part of the promised land, that God grants it to them, and it was his to give and take. That they're to think of themselves, in fact, as strangers, as foreigners, as sojourners in the land, that they are aliens here on earth. They were people dwelling in a place temporarily. And this is actually how we as the church are encouraged to think of ourselves. We see two examples here in Hebrews chapter 11, 13 through 16. Here's God, the author of Hebrews, talking about a lot of the Old Testament saints, right? And he says, "These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of the land from which they had gone out, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city." We see in John chapter 18, Jesus speaking, and he says, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting that I might not be delivered over to the Jews, but my kingdom is not from this world." We are to think of ourselves as having a heavenly citizenship, as our home being in the next life, not in the current one. Now we see in this passage this concept of a redeemer, that if a man became poor, had to sell some of his property, it was possible, and really even the responsibility of a near relative to come and redeem that property for him, to pay the price back, to get the land back. This is where we get this concept of calling Jesus our Redeemer. That's where this song that we sang earlier, that hymn that we sang earlier, comes from this concept. That's why there's a part of that song that even says, "My lost estate to save," speaking in terms of property, because it's where this idea comes from, that Jesus as our Redeemer came and paid the debt that we owed to rescue us. Nearly all sales would be reset in the Jubilee, but in the meantime, a Redeemer could come and pay it off and get it back. Now, there are a few exceptions here that we see for apartments and houses that were within walled cities. Those could be sold in perpetuity because they were not connected to the means for someone to make a living off of the land. But any land, so any houses that were associated with land, had to be returned in the Jubilee. We also see an exception for the Levites, that they can redeem at any time because they don't operate like a normal tribe. They're the priests, and they don't make their living off of the land. They serve in the tabernacle and serve the people as priests. All right, we'll look lastly here at verses 35 through 55. "If your brother becomes poor and cannot maintain himself with you, you shall support him as though he were a stranger and a sojourner, and he shall live with you. Take no interest from him or profit, but fear your God, that your brother may live beside you. You shall not lend him your money at interest, nor give him your food for profit. I am Yahweh your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan and to be your God. If your brother becomes poor beside you and sells himself to you, you shall not make him serve as a slave. He shall be with you as a hired worker, and as a sojourner he shall serve with you until the year of Jubilee. Then he shall go out from you, he and his children with him, and go back to his own clan and return to the possession of his fathers. For they are my servants, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt, that they should not be sold as slaves. You shall not rule over him ruthlessly, but you shall fear your God. As for your male and female slaves whom you have, you may buy male and female slaves from among the nations that are around you. You may also buy from among the strangers who sojourn with you, and their clans that are with you, who have been born in your land, and they may be your property. You may bequeath them to your sons after you to inherit as a possession forever. You shall make slaves of them, but over your brothers, the people of Israel, you shall not rule one over another ruthlessly. If a stranger or sojourner with you becomes rich, and your brother beside him becomes poor and sells himself to the stranger or sojourner with you, or to a member of the stranger's clan, then after he is sold, he may be redeemed. One of your brothers may redeem him, or his uncle or his cousin may redeem him, or a close relative from his clan may redeem him. Or if he grows rich, he may redeem himself. He shall calculate with his buyer from the year from which he sold himself to him until the year of Jubilee, and the price of his sale shall vary with the number of years. The time he was with his owner shall be rated as the time of a hired worker. If there are still many years left, he shall pay proportionately for his redemption some of the sale price. If there remain but a few years until the year of Jubilee, he shall calculate and pay for his redemption in property to his years of service. He shall treat him as a worker hired year by year. He shall not rule ruthlessly over him in your sight. And if he is not redeemed by these means, then he and his children with him shall be released in the year of Jubilee. For it is for me that the people of Israel are servants. They are my servants, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. I am Yahweh, your God. Okay. We'll get to the slavery bit in a minute. But first, let's go back. There were some nice parts before that. Okay. If your brother becomes poor, right? It starts off, if your brother becomes poor and cannot maintain himself with you, they have some obligations. First, it says that you shall support him. That if a fellow Israelite becomes poor, it's a responsibility of the community to support him. This is certainly true of close family members, but it really applies to the tribe as a whole. And this is the concept of loving one's neighbor as yourself. Or that they're really fleshing out this idea of what does it mean to love one another as you love yourself. He also says that he shall live with you, that they were literally to bring them in to live alongside them. They could lodge with them. Not necessarily in the same house. They might build a dwelling next door to them on their property, but it's not out of the question that they would even live in the same house as them. The comparison that he makes, interestingly, is that they should be treated like a stranger or sojourner. The implication there is that a stranger or sojourner would be treated well in Israel. He's kind of already established that fact that a stranger or sojourner should be treated well. And so then he says, you should treat your brother like you would a stranger or sojourner. Now that might seem a little backwards. You might say like, well, shouldn't you tell them to treat the stranger or sojourner as well as they treat a close brother or member of the tribe? But oftentimes, that's true for some people. For some people, they treat those that are close to them well, even if they're in need or in trouble, and then treat foreigners not as well. But that's not true for everyone. I've seen many people who, especially when someone gets himself into a bad situation in life, someone gets themselves into a bad situation, like he talks about here, they become poor. Sometimes when you know that person well, it's challenging to love them because you know each and every step along the way when they messed up and how they got themselves in that situation. You know how many people tried to help them. Right? You know how many people tried to support them, how many people tried to come alongside them, how many chances they were given. And sometimes you're just sick of it. But you come along somebody off the street who is in the same situation, but you don't know any of that. It's a lot easier for you to be compassionate. It's a lot easier to be loving and compassionate with that person that you don't know anything about than the person that you know a lot about. And that's the challenge that he's giving them here. He's saying essentially, love them no matter what. Support them in this, even if they get themselves into these bad situations, that we need to care for them. And it can often be more difficult to be compassionate with those we're closer to. We also see specifically that they're forbidden from profiting off of someone's need, right? They can't lend at interest. They can lend money, but they can't lend at interest. I mean, they should just expect back exactly what they lent. They're also not to sell them food for a profit, right? They can sell them food, but they can't profit off of that food. They should sell it at cost. This concept of loving one another well carries through to the New Testament, and it's how we're told to care for one another within the church. A couple of examples, and it's all through the New Testament, but a couple of examples. James chapter 2, 15 through 17. If a brother or sister is poorly clothed and lacking in daily food, and one of you says to them, go in peace, be warm and filled, without giving them the things needed for the body, what good is that? So also faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. John chapter 13, 34, a new commandment I give you, that's Jesus speaking, that you love one another, just as I have loved you, you also are to love one another. Romans 13, 8, owe no one anything except to love each other, for the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. Notice that the Israelites were the people of God. They were God's chosen people. The church is called the family of God. God's covenant community is the same. The character of God's covenant community is the same across the Old Testament and New Testament. The Old Covenant and New Covenant. Now, let's dive into this slavery bit. So first off, we got great. No Israelite slaves. We love to hear no slaves. Wish it wasn't specific. But no Israelite slaves. I mean, the Israelites among themselves were not to have any slaves. They could hire each other as workers, but they could not sell themselves permanently into slavery. They could, however, own slaves from anybody else. That the law of Moses permits and regulates slavery. That's a very uncomfortable idea for a lot of us. Again, I think that when we read this, we kind of go like, boy, I wish it just said, don't have slaves. I wish it just said no slavery. That would be a lot easier for us to digest. But it doesn't. So we have to process this a little bit and think about what is it really saying here, and what kind of context do we need to understand this well. So a couple things to keep in mind as we read this. First off, the idea of just abolishing and outlawing slavery outright, totally, is a relatively new idea in history. So in the course of world history, for all people, all times, the amount of time in which anyone has even thought of outlawing or abolishing slavery is very small. It's a very small amount of time in which that concept has gained popularity, even been floated whatsoever. I know it feels like, because it's been illegal for your whole life, that's been abolished for your whole life. It feels like it's always been that way, but it's just really not that far back. You don't have to go that many generations back for slavery to exist, and then for all time before that, it existed across all cultures, all over the world. So that's a relatively new idea, first off. Secondly, most slavery at this time was the result of individual debt, meaning that for the kind of slavery that is being talked about here, that God's talking about here, is that they would incur debt, they would incur a lot of debt and not be able to pay it back. And you would get yourself in that situation, and you would go to someone and say like, hey, could you use a slave? Could you use somebody that could work for you? And then they would pay their debt. This person would then go work for them voluntarily. They're selling themselves into slavery voluntarily for this person who would then house them, feed them, and give them work to do. That process is not as different from employment as we think of it. Right? That's not that different than the way we think of modern employment. We also see that not all master-slave relationships were cruel. Not all master-slave relationships were cruel. And in fact, the Israelites are commanded to be good masters, a command that is followed into the New Testament. So in New Testament, Ephesians chapter 6, 5 through 9, bondservants, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart, as you would Christ. Not by the way of eye service as people pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, rendering service with a good will as to the Lord and not to man, knowing that whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether he is a bondservant or is free. Masters, do the same to them and stop your threatening, knowing that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and that there is no partiality with them. Notice there at the end, he even says, you will have a master in heaven who is Lord over both of you, both master and slave, and there's no partiality with him. He doesn't see you any differently. So the next thing that we should also keep in mind is that this form of slavery is not based on the presumption of racial superiority. God tells them not to have slaves among themselves. That's in large part in memory of their time in Egypt. Right? He does tell them they can sell themselves to each other, but that they had to be released on the Jubilee. So there is slavery just with a reset date every 50 years. But they should remember the time they were in Egypt and were slaves in Egypt. God set them free, that they do not re-enter slavery. But he tells them they can buy slaves from other people groups. But it's not because they are superior in some way, the way that we have typically seen that in our history. That's not that any specific people group was targeted as inferior and worthy of slavery. In general, as we look at the commands about slavery, slaves and masters in both the Old Testament and the New Testament, we really get, because we got to go like, well, but how do I apply this to myself? I'm not going to own any slaves. Not intending on it. and I don't intend on being a slave at any point. So what do I do with this information? In general, I think as we read about these commands, both in the Old Testament and New Testament, in regard to master-slave relationships, it applies much better in our day to employer-employee relationships than it ever did to the American form of slavery. I don't believe that God would approve. I believe that God would not have approved of American slavery based on its cruelty and presumption of racial superiority. In general, when we think about slavery and the way that it's talked about in Scripture, we see something that I think occurs we can see multiple places in Scripture in which something is permissible but not preferable. So there's several things we see in Scripture where God uses and even gives instruction for how something should function when it is permissible, even if it's not the preferable form. So we see this certainly with marriage in the Old Testament. So you see think about somebody like Jacob, who has 2 wives, right? He's the father of the 12 tribes of Israel. Pretty important guy. He ends up marrying 2 wives because of some trickery that happens there. And then those wives also have servants who they end up giving to him as well. So he ends up having children with 4 different women in this bizarre baby race that they're having together. That's not God's design for marriage. Right? That's not God's design for marriage. Clearly, it's not how he made it to be, and how he ends up talking about it, how it should be, is not that. But he still uses it, still tells them how, gives them advice. There's all kinds of stuff that happens in that story where God is working through it, even though it's not his ideal design of how he wanted marriage to work. I think we can see that with something like slavery. That God was kind of saying, okay, this is clearly happening, going to happen. Be good masters. I think that's one thing that we sometimes miss is the fact that he's telling them not to be cruel, to only be good masters, not to rule ruthlessly over one another, that was a huge leap forward in terms of reform of this practice. That's a huge leap forward that people would be hearing that and going what do you think? We have to be nice? Well, come on. These are snowflakes, that kind of thing. That this is a huge leap forward at the time that it was written. It was permissible but not preferable. I do think that God and the angels rejoiced when slavery was abolished entirely. When there's much less slavery, certainly in the developed world today than there in history. I think that's something that God rejoices over. I think God rejoices at every slave that is ever set free. And then, unfortunately, slavery does still exist today in parts of the world. And I think God rejoices when those things when people are set free. I think it's what he prefers, even though he says, hey, here's a way to do it, even if it's not preferable. And I think we should see that in our own lives, that there are things certainly that we do, that we go through, that God permits, that he says, okay, yes, you can do this, but it might not be what he prefers, and we need to seek what he prefers, not just what he will permit. We'll wrap up with this, 3 takeaways for today's message. Number 1, trust that God will provide as you obey him. Right? Trust that he will provide to accomplish his purposes as you step out in faith in obedience to him. Number 2, see yourself as a sojourner during your time on earth. Recognize that you have a greater citizenship in heaven. And then lastly, seek what God would prefer, not just what he will permit. Oftentimes, see Christians get in this position of going well, what could I get God to let me do? How could I get it, make it happen and sneak around? And how can I get right up to the edge of what he will allow? Versus saying, God, you know me best. You know what is best for me. I want what you want for me, not just what you'll allow. In just a minute, I'm going to pray, and then we'll take communion together. We'll sing one final song. And then if you'd like prayer for anything, we'll have a prayer team that'll be right over here. You can come up, and they would love to pray for you. Would you bow with me now? Heavenly Father, we thank you for this morning that we can gather in your name. And God, we just thank you for your word, even when it is challenging, even when it's confusing. We thank you for sending it to us. Thank you that we can see how you worked through Israel, through history, to bring us Jesus. We thank you that he is our great Redeemer. Pray these things in his precious name. Amen.